Tyrion Lannister is undeniably one of the best written characters in the entire world of Ice and Fire, and one of the most interesting elements of his journey and story within A Song of Ice and Fire is that, although every point of view is skewed, his personal perspective is one of the most unreliable narratives in the entire story. Tyrion is clearly one of the most intelligent and interesting characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and the amount of pathos that is baked into the character before the story even begins makes him a very compelling read. Clearly, as a dwarf who occupies the highest echelon of Westerosi society, he offers a unique perspective on this world, and many of his internal thoughts and beliefs seem to be contradictory or inconsistent as a result of this broader conflict. However, Tyrion's more disturbing character traits and decisions are often watered down or outright ignored, partially because his character was so thoroughly whitewashed throughout Game of Thrones, and partially because his point of view is easy to understand but absurdly skewed in A Song of Ice and Fire. His inner thoughts make him relatable, but they also present an outrageously egocentric view of everything that he goes through, which makes him a more sympathetic character and makes his more antagonistic aspects easier to ignore. He has a very clear villainous streak within him, however, and when his own self-centered perspective on what he does is looked at from a different angle, Tyrion is actually a fascinatingly disturbed character. Tyrion Lannister is someone who has been abused by his only parent for his entire life, because of his dwarfism and because Joanna Lannister died having him. And he has been similarly and horrifically abused by his sister for the loss of their mother and because of Cersei's obsession with prophecy. And while Jaime at least loves him, he has enabled a lot of Tyrion's most traumatic experiences. Beyond that, the world hasn't treated him particularly kindly either, so it's not hard to see how he became what he is now. Clearly, he is not without redeeming qualities, but his redemptive aspects and his overall appeal as a character often lead to willful misinterpretation of his darkest facets. And one of the most interesting and terrifying elements of that darkness is Tyrion's relationship with romance. The book's insight into Tyrion's mind actually presents a fascinating perspective on love, as he is someone who is obviously desperate to be loved and he has a very romantic streak to him. But his experience with Tysha was undeniably an extreme trauma that completely altered the way that Tyrion feels about love and sexuality, and that experience has informed how he treats romantic relationships going forward. Tysha rightfully gets a lot of sympathy for the horror that she goes through, but what happened to Tyrion was criminally abusive as well, and given his insecurities and the way that the world has always treated him before and after that incident, it comes as no surprise that he becomes desperate for validation and love, but always seems to seek it from places he knows he will never get it. However, with that said, Tyrion's attitude when it comes to love is incredibly entitled, self-centered, and exploitative. And although it is uncomfortable to acknowledge, he almost certainly had that perspective before Tywin horrifically traumatized him via Tysha. Within Tyrion's own mind, it seems like his relationship with Tysha is the height of romance. It was impulsive young love, and when he reminisces on it, he makes it sound as if it might have been the only time he was truly happy. But his perception of their relationship seems like it was almost certainly warped. And again, it was so before Tywin even intervened. Tyrion is an interesting character because he occupies two drastically different ends of the Westerosi social spectrum. He is among the highest elites as a Lannister, and he is part of a marginalized group because he is a dwarf. But Tyrion oftentimes seems to solely see his marginalization and ignore his privilege, especially when it comes to any situation where he can see himself as a victim, but where other victims might also be present. He is capable of empathizing with victims, but he often sees himself as their equal, or oftentimes as an even more victimized person, despite the fact that he is unfathomably more powerful than they are. And Tysha is a pretty perfect example of Tyrion's misunderstanding or willful ignorance regarding his social status. One aspect of Tyrion's tale of Tysha in A Song of Ice and Fire is pretty much never discussed, but seems like a very blatant red flag that should not be ignored. In A Game of Thrones Tyrion 6, he says, "She was hungrier than I would have believed. We finished 2 whole chickens and part of a third, and drank a flagon of wine, talking. I was only 13, and the wine went to my head, I fear. The next thing I knew, I was sharing her bed. If she was shy, I was shyer. I'll never know where I found the courage. When I broke her maidenhead, she wept, but afterward she kissed me and sang her little song, and by morning I was in love." I don't think what's jumping out to me here should come as a huge surprise, but the fact that he literally says, "When I broke her maidenhead, she wept," is a very odd detail to include that should ring a lot of alarm bells despite the fact that it almost never does. Interestingly, although Game of Thrones adapted nearly every aspect of this story into the show itself, it omitted this particular point, and it's not hard to understand why. The TV series basically made Tyrion into an underdog hero, and even a series that's as sexually tone-deaf as Game of Thrones probably realized that girls crying during intercourse is not a good look for Tyrion. So while it's not impossible that Tysha was just as consenting as she could be and was just crying from the pain, again, this is a very strange detail to include in Tyrion's recounting if the reader is not supposed to question what's going on here and if reality might differ from his own recounting of it. George R. R. Martin pretty consistently plays around with faulty memory within his own characters, and the strange discordance with this detail makes it seem pretty plausible that Tyrion is misremembering or misinterpreting some part of what happened when he slept with Tysha. And even if he remembers things exactly as they were, there is really no way that Tyrion's perception could be a full accounting of reality. Consent in the world of Ice and Fire is an incredibly sticky situation, because in a society that is so focused on social stratification, the question of whether or not consent is even possible in most situations is a pretty significant one. But when it comes to Tyrion and Tysha, that question is especially relevant. Tyrion literally characterizes Tysha as a half-starved orphan from the Westerlands, while he is the son of Tywin Lannister. Considering the unfathomable gulf between their two social statuses, it really begs the question of whether or not Tysha was under the impression that saying no to Tyrion was even an option, and frankly, whether or not that really was an option. And clearly, this is a distinction that Tyrion completely fails to acknowledge. However, just as clearly, it seems like Tyrion has a subconscious understanding of his power over most women he encounters, because he continually seeks out love from girls and women that he has an enormous amount of power over, and he is extremely bitter when he doesn't get it. Again, the difference between the book and TV version of Shae is massive, and it's hard not to imagine that this was partially driven by Game of Thrones' desire to present Tyrion as much more heroic than he is in the books. But with that in mind, that also likely means that the writers saw the villainous subtext within this storyline, because if they didn't, then they wouldn't have done anything to mitigate it in the first place. So, while the Shae of Game of Thrones is at least an obviously adult woman, the Shae of A Song of Ice and Fire is about 18 years old, meaning that in addition to being outrageously wealthy and powerful in comparison to Shae, Tyrion is also significantly older than her in the novels. Obviously, she is Tyrion's paid companion who he takes a liking to, and their relationship develops before ending in a horrific fashion. Largely because of his experience with Tysha, Tyrion obviously has hang-ups about paying for love, and when it comes to Shae, he paradoxically wants her to care for him and sometimes believes that she does, while also resenting her for essentially being exactly what she always was, which was his paid companion. Tyrion also believes himself to love her, but the progression of their relationship and his complete and total misunderstanding of her as a person would indicate otherwise. He completely fails to acknowledge the fact that he essentially owns her, as their arrangement evolves into a scenario where Tyrion controls every aspect of her life. Given the genesis of their relationship, it comes as no great shock that Tyrion can be somewhat objectifying towards Shae, but his eventual murder of her really drives home the fact that he doesn't see her as a fully formed entity outside of himself. His expectation of loyalty from her in general is unreasonable, but the fact that he essentially kills her for betraying him and not saying the exact right thing when he sees her for the last time really demonstrates that he has no concept of what Shae's position actually is, and only valued her as something of a receptacle for his feelings and traumas. Firstly, what Shae tells him about Cersei and Tywin is almost certainly true. She is no more in a position to deny them than she was in to deny Tyrion. So to express any loyalty to Tyrion in the face of their demands would have probably gotten her killed. And obviously, the fact that Tyrion expected Shae to literally die instead of betraying him is insane, and once again demonstrates how absurdly self-absorbed and objectifying he is when it comes to romantic relationships. Beyond that, he really shows a fundamental inability to understand Shae as a person. It's not surprising that he can't really relate to a low-born woman who has had to sell herself to survive, but he doesn't really try to relate to her unless it serves his own interest either. Again, when he can empathize with her victimhood, he does, but he sees his marginalized self reflected within her without recognizing how absurdly privileged he is in comparison to her. He gets what he wants from her and offers her a great deal in the realm of material things, but he also expects her to give him whatever he needs and whatever he doesn't, while expecting her to kowtow to his requests despite the fact that he consistently denies hers. Although he paid for her, controlled her, and literally murdered her, when he recalls his experiences with her, his reactions are varied. Sometimes he empathizes with her, sometimes he's angry with her and seems to think she earned what he did to her, and sometimes he disconnects himself from what he actually did to her. Unsurprisingly, Tyrion's habit of making himself the main character of his story while treating the women he has a romantic interest in as little more than his supporting cast doesn't end when it comes to Sansa Stark either. Again, in a shift that the TV series made from the page, the Game of Thrones version of Tyrion is an unwilling participant in his wedding who never even considers Sansa as a romantic partner, while the Song of Ice and Fire version actively chooses to marry Sansa because he wants to be Lord of Winterfell, and because he doesn't want to marry someone he finds unattractive, Lawless Stokeworth. And again, his relationship with Sansa is actually fascinating because it is so radically influenced by his own point of view. In his own mind, he is a kind and caring husband who wants his wife to trust him and open up to him. He wants to be wanted by Sansa, and he feels like he is being charitable by waiting for her to decide to be with him rather than forcing himself on her. Although I do think it's worth noting that he comes to this decision on their wedding night after Sansa has already undressed and he begins touching her, and then he realizes that she's scared and revolted. And in turn, when Sansa rejects him and suggests that she might never want him, he becomes incredibly self-pitying and seems to see himself as a victim, despite the fact that he actively decided to do this, and despite the fact that Sansa is a child who has been horrifically victimized by the Lannisters, including Tyrion, who literally chose to marry her because she was hotter than his other option, and gave him the opportunity to grasp the power that he has always felt he should have been given, but has consistently been denied. Of course, from a more rational perspective, it's not hard whatsoever to understand why Sansa would be terrified and mistrusting. She is a hostage who has been married off with the intention that she be forcibly impregnated and have a Lannister child that could ultimately inherit Winterfell. And we can see this reflected repeatedly in her own point of view. While Tyrion takes Sansa's rejection personally, her behavior around him simply seems to match her behavior around everyone else. Essentially, she is constantly trying to figure out whether or not she's being manipulated, and doesn't know what to say or what to do in order to avoid further punishment. And that completely makes sense, because while in Tyrion's mind he's a very nice guy who is jilted at the thought that his niceness might never be romantically rewarded, in Sansa's mind and from the point of view of most reasonable observers, he is simply yet another one of her captors who is attempting to exploit her. Unsettlingly, Sansa does appreciate the fact that Tyrion is at least not as brutal as some of her other captors, but I think a lot of readers overestimate the importance of this. Many people seem to take Sansa's relatively more positive view of Tyrion as an indication that he really isn't such a bad guy. But what it almost certainly is an indication of is that everyone around Sansa just totally sucks. Yes, she doesn't think Tyrion is as bad as Cersei or Joffrey, but they're Cersei and Joffrey. She similarly thinks more positively of Aerys Oakheart than the rest of the Kingsguard, because he doesn't beat her as hard as they do. But he's still an adult man abusing a child at the behest of Joffrey. Sansa reflects on Tyrion not being as bad as some, but it's worth remembering that her scale for awful behavior is incredibly warped. And it's worth remembering that she doesn't know what kind of things Tyrion has really done. She doesn't know that he murdered Shae with his own hands for her imagined betrayal. She appreciates that he doesn't assault her when she really has no ability to stop him. But she doesn't realize that he has already engaged in what sounds suspiciously like assault with Tysha, even before they're both victimized by Tywin, as well as assaulting a slave in Cell Horus that even he, through his incredibly malformed view on sexuality, seems to recognize as assault. And it seems safe to assume that Sansa's feelings about him would be radically different if she had actually seen what kind of person he was rather than the romantic fantasy that he was attempting to engage with in their marriage. Once again, this is an issue that is completely sidestepped in Game of Thrones. Tyrion's actions with the Sunset Girl don't happen in the show, and despite relegating Sansa to little more than Tyrion's PR spokeswoman in the last 2 seasons, they never even address the fact that Tyrion murdered Shae, someone Sansa cared for deeply in the TV series. So while Game of Thrones completely failed to include or resolve any of Tyrion's issues with romantic relationships, as well as his bizarre sense of entitlement with Sansa and Winterfell, it seems likely that this will be a significant problem going forward in the books. Because again, if it weren't going to be a mess that required a lot of cleaning up, then the show probably wouldn't have gone so far out of its way to sidestep it in the first place. Book Tyrion still fixates on and laments his lost wives. It seems as if some kind of reckoning regarding whatever actually happened to Tysha is coming. And it'll be interesting to see if that resolution, or potential explosion, happens before or after Tyrion reunites with Sansa. But if Tyrion returns to Westeros embittered and at the side of Daenerys Targaryen, then it's likely that Tyrion's unresolved romantic trauma will have a powerful effect on the storyline at large. If he holds on to the belief that, because he didn't mistreat or force himself on Sansa when he had the opportunity to, he therefore hasn't been given what was due to him, Sansa and Winterfell, then the enmity between the Starks and Daenerys, as well as Sansa's wariness and aggression in particular, would make a great deal more sense. And unfortunately, it would seem very on brand for Tyrion when it comes to his ideas of romance. If he just sees Sansa as a cog in the machine of his tragedy, and if he becomes angry that she's not sufficiently appreciative of his decision to be a kind captor or is not apologetic enough for supposedly leaving him to take the fall for Joffrey, then the likelihood that he will take that imagined insult lying down seems incredibly low. Ultimately, that's just speculation about the future. However, the realities of who Tyrion Lannister is and how he views women in his sphere of influence, as well as his own position in relation to them, is a frightening and violent facet of his characterization that is way too often ignored. He might see Tysha, Shae, and Sansa as cast members in his own drama, rather than fully formed humans with inner lives in their own right. But George R.R. Martin almost certainly didn't intend for the audience to see them in the same way. Tyrion is quite deft at recognizing his own victimization, but his ability to empathize with others doesn't go very far. His belief that he has been denied what the world owed him while simultaneously brutalizing the women he supposedly loves, and intentionally misconstruing or completely ignoring their victimization at his hands, is a conflict that will need to be confronted in A Song of Ice and Fire. And unfortunately, whatever resolution comes from it will almost certainly bear no resemblance of Game of Thrones' take, where Sansa commends Tyrion for being such a kind husband, and Tyrion happily walks away from their marriage without objection. Tyrion rightfully sees himself as a marginalized victim of Westerosi society. But in one way or another, Tyrion is going to have to confront the other side of that coin, and understand that he has a great deal of power over others, and he almost always abuses it. But what do you think? Does Tyrion have major issues with love that have to be addressed before his story ends in A Song of Ice and Fire? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.